little recording.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. All right. So we'll go ahead and get this started. Next slide, please. All right. So the agenda today, we're going to go through a brief welcome and introductions, kind of already doing that. Then we'll go over a review of the TCC or Transformative Climate Communities program. Then we'll move into the AHSC or Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities housing requirements. Move into a Q&A and then move into next steps for all of you who are interested in this process. And
Clancy, you're muted.
now I mute myself. Oh, yeah. So I just want to give a quick shout out to all the SGC and AHSC folks here in the virtual room. We appreciate you all being here. I think they noted in the chat that they are here. So we have some technical assistance providers, and we also have some of the administrators of the program. So my name is Clancy Taylor. I am a technical assistance programs manager for the California Coalition for Rural Housing. We are a statewide affordable housing advocacy nonprofit, and we specialize in rural, tribal, and farm worker communities throughout the state of California. So through advocacy, organizing, research, and technical assistance, our goal is to make the case for rural housing improvements and to strengthen the capacity of public and nonprofit sectors for affordable housing throughout the state. And then also in attendance from CCRH, we have
Oh no, I think Clancy has frozen. Okay, hopefully their internet comes back. Apologies all. The stormy weather has caused some technical difficulties for sure. Clancy was about to introduce me. Hi, I'm Kate Rose. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance here at the California Coalition for Rural Housing. I'll go ahead and let Christine introduce the enterprise team.
Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Williams, and along with my colleague Alejandro Herza, we are here representing Enterprise Community Partners. We're a nonprofit that works nationwide across the United States on all things affordable housing. And here in California, we are the lead technical assistance provider for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, and we are part of the technical assistance team for the Transformative Climate Communities program. So we work directly with you if it looks like you may have a housing component you're interested in pursuing under TCC. So looking forward to kind of reviewing how these two programs work together with you today. And I will pause. Clancy, are you back on the line?
if you all can hear me, I am.
We can. I will turn it back over to you to get us going here.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for your patience as we work through, technical issues in the Sacramento area. So Kate, next slide. Learning objective. Yes, thank you. So what we're hoping to achieve today, this webinar will train prospective TCC applicants on the major household threshold requirements from AHSC. So again, this is kind of an intro. How do we start doing these things? Start getting the big picture. The overall goal is to help prepare the applicants interested in including a housing component in their TCC applications. The TCC and the AHSC applications can be a little bit long, so it's good that you all are here getting the full scope and starting to understand today. Next slide, Kate. All right, so TCC, we keep mentioning it. A brief overview of what it is. So it is the Transformative Climate Communities. It is to allow community-led transformation to enable California communities most impacted by pollution to choose their own goals, strategies, and projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and local air pollution. So a couple of the key points about TCC: it is community-led, it is transformative, and it is flexible to meet the needs of your specific community. Next slide, please. And a brief overview of what the program is. So it was established in 2016. We are going on round 6 now. It is for greenhouse gas reducing projects to bring economic, environmental, and health benefits to the community. Community benefits to avoid economic displacement of those who are already there, and allow for comprehensive community engagement and to leverage funds. So the big overall with the TCC program, it's working together many levels of government and many community organizations collaborating for neighborhood level transformation. Next slide, please. And then TCC, it includes two types of grants. So we have the planning grants and we have the implementation grants. Planning grants are awards of up to $300,000. They are to help prepare traditionally disadvantaged communities for future opportunities, historically disenfranchised communities. And this grant term is up to 2 years with the option to extend on a case-by-case basis. And the idea with the planning grants is to help you prepare for an TCC implementation or other type of grant program. These awards are $35 million each, and the implementation grants allow neighborhood level infrastructure proposals and include multiple coordinated projects. The grant term of the implementation grants is up to 5 years, followed by an additional year of evaluation. Next slide, please. And with this, I'm going to pass it on over to our experts over at Enterprise to give us a more scoop on what an implementation grant looks like.
Great, thanks, Clancy. So this is Alejandro Huerta again with Enterprise Community Partners, Senior Program Director. So I'll begin the section on how we apply AHSC and TCC together. Before I do that, I did want to emphasize that the focus of this webinar today is on the implementation grant strategies. I know there's some questions out there about the other types of grants available. And the primary focus within the implementation grants are the equitable housing and neighborhood development strategies, which you could see listed here. So as Clancy mentioned, applicants can apply to up to $35 million to fund a variety of capital projects that collectively achieve climate resiliency goals. As you can see on this slide, these projects can fall under any of these strategies defined by the TCC program. And you can see there's quite a bit. For those of you who are interested in funding a housing development using TCC funds, you will have to select the equitable housing and neighborhood development strategy from this menu of options. Those of you familiar with AHSC or ASIC will notice that there is a lot of overlap between the eligible types of projects. And as you can see, if you're familiar with AHSC, TCC has a little bit of a larger scope in terms of the types of eligible projects. So again, today we will emphasize that we are focusing on the equitable housing and neighborhood development strategy under TCC. So with that, I will ask for the next slide, please. Okay, so I will now go into the details of how AHSC is integrated into the TCC program for the next round, which will be round 5 of TCC. First of all, for the strategy that I just showed you before on the previous slide, TCC relies on the ASIC guidelines. So what that means is that the ASIC guidelines are in effect incorporated into the TCC program for that equitable neighborhood strategy that I mentioned. So if and when you apply to TCC, if you wish to include a housing development as part of your application, you'll have to select that strategy, and then actually you'll be required to fill all the ASIC requirements that are required for the affordable housing development. And we'll go into that in the next set of slides. But for now, it's important to realize that if you are planning to apply for the next round of TCC, and we'll go into the schedule at the end of this presentation, you will be required to adhere to the round 7 ASIC application guidelines. So thankfully, though, there are a lot of shared goals between ASIC and TCC, so the two programs are a good match. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for those who are not familiar with AHSC, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program is a cap and trade funded greenhouse gas reduction fund program that jointly funds affordable housing developments and transportation improvements. The goals of ASIC are to reduce the use of single occupancy vehicle use, build infill affordable housing, and to increase access between the housing and key destinations, among other co-benefits. The end goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which it shares, of course, with TCC. Now, let me go a little bit more into what ASIC funds in the next slide, but don't worry, I'll tie us back to TCC in a bit. Thanks, Kate. So at its most fundamental basic level, AHSC or AHSC is a last-in gap financing program for new affordable housing developments that are shovel-ready. But as I mentioned before, AHSC also requires that along with the housing development, transportation improvements must also be included in your funding request. I'm not going to go into the details here, but the easiest way to think about this is that AHSC requires close collaboration between housing developers and public agencies to create sustainable communities. And it funds all these kinds of things on this slide, including the housing development, sustainable transportation infrastructure, transportation-related amenities. And as you can see here, the eligible applicants are developers and public agencies and other MPOs. And with that, I'm going to tie us back to TCC with the next slide, please. Okay, thank you, Kate. So before you kind of figure out if you're going to apply to TCC, you have to ask yourself if you have an eligible housing type. And again, since the TCC guidelines defer to the AHSC guidelines, I'm going to share with you how and specifically what those AHSC guidelines are as it relates to housing. So what you have to essentially do is you have to fund a housing development using the criteria set out in the AHSC Round 7 guidelines. In terms of what is allowable in terms of housing, the most common types of eligible housing developments we see are rental developments, which can include multifamily developments as well as senior projects. Some, but not all projects are mixed-use projects. Here, for example, is a completed AHSC-funded project from the city of Los Angeles from a couple of rounds ago. It is important to note that if you apply for housing funds through AHSC or TCC, the project cannot have started construction before applying. Note that you must also use TCC or AHSC to help fund the new housing development. So again, these are the types of eligible housing types that we see in AHSC. So if you have a rental multifamily project, can be senior or not, then you have an eligible project according to the AHSC guidelines. In addition, next slide, please. There are several other types of housing that are available and eligible for AHSC and therefore TCC, and those are home ownership and substantial rehabilitation and conversion development projects. For conversion, that means non-residential to residential. Here's an example, an image of an awarded home ownership project from the previous round of AHSC. So although these are less common, the point I'm making is that there are various housing development options that are eligible to fund through AHSC or TCC. Next, we'll go into the details of the AHSC housing requirements that are incorporated into TCC to see if you have an eligible project. Next slide, please. So once you've determined if you have one of those eligible housing development types, i.e. rental or homeownership or conversion or rehab, then you next have to see if your project site specifically in your specific housing development meets these two requirements. The first requirement is the availability of transit. And the second requirement is a specific density minimum, which my colleague will explain in a bit. But it's important to remember that you must fulfill all of these requirements if you wish to use TCC funding to help fund a new housing development. The two factors on this slide determine your affordable housing project area type, which again are defined by the AHSC guidelines. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to dig deep into these specific requirements. So the first requirement is that there must be transit available within a half mile walking distance of your housing site. And I have to emphasize, this has to be within a walkable route. This is very important because if you do not have transit available with a transit stop within the half mile, then you can't apply to TCC or AHSC for that matter. But there are some exceptions and some specifics to think about, which my colleague will go into a little bit later. So the first thing to figure out is if there is a transit stop or station. In this image, for example, you can see the housing site in the middle, and you see the blue transit station icon, which means that there is a transit station within a half mile. You must also make sure that the transit at the stop passes at least once or twice during the peak morning and afternoon times. Next, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Christine, to explain how the specific type of transit available and the density of your project determines your housing project area type.
Thanks, Alejandro. Okay, so you're considering a site. You've determined, at least for the time being, that there is a qualifying transit stop. So that in turn means you are eligible for both AHSC and therefore the TCC program. The next piece, as Alejandro mentioned, is determining what project area type you qualify under. And that is important because there are some different threshold requirements for those different project area types. Specifically, the required density of your housing site. So this slide shows the AHSC program's 3 project area type buckets: TOD for transit-oriented development, ICP for integrated connectivity project, and what we call RIPA for rural innovation project area. And essentially, the distinguishing factor here is the level of transit that is adjacent to your site. So if your housing site is within a half mile from what the program terms high quality transit, and that's typically going to be some kind of fixed rail service with high, 15-minute service frequency, and some type of permanent infrastructure. So some BRT, bus rapid transit services fall into this category. Then you are considered a transit-oriented development TOD project. If you are not proximate to that high quality transit, so say it's more of a typical kind of local bus service, it does not operate on any kind of fixed permanent infrastructure, then you are likely an ICP, an integrated connectivity project. And if your site qualifies as rural, then CCRH will walk through how to determine whether you have a rural site. You're automatically put into the RIPA category. Now, again, the importance of this is that it determines the minimum threshold density to which you need to develop. So if you are a TOD site, you have a minimum requirement of 30 units to the acre. If you're an ICP, it's 20 units to the acre. And if you are a RIPA, it is 15 units to the acre. And those, again, are minimum density thresholds your housing site would need to meet. There are some allowable deductible areas. If you're not sure you're going to meet these density thresholds, you would want to talk to one of us and we can kind of look at the site with you and help you make that determination. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, in order to have an eligible AHSC/TCC site, you need to have that housing be served by transit within a half mile. Alejandro mentioned that you need, in order to qualify for the TOD and the ICP sites, you need to have that service in place by the time you submit your TCC application. There is an exemption for the rural RIPA project types. If you do not have existing qualifying transit at the time of application, you can use AHSC or TCC funds to bring that qualifying transit into service as long as it is operating by the time your housing site is placed in service. So keep that in mind. And I do see there's a question on again, how you're determining high quality transit. High quality transit is any service with peak period service frequency at 15 minutes or less, and it has to be and the existence of permanent infrastructure. So again, that means it's some type of rail service or a qualifying bus rapid transit service. Okay, next slide, please. I think I'm kicking this over to you, Kate, to walk through how to determine if your site is rural and therefore you're in that RIPA set aside.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. So yes, exactly. This slide goes over how to determine rural status. AHSC and therefore TCC use the same definition as the Tax Credit Allocation Committee for rural. So you'll be familiar with this methodology if you've submitted a low-income housing tax credit application. A project competing as a rural project or again, a RIPA project must meet one of the three methodologies listed on the slide here. The first methodology is that the project is in a non-metro county, and those counties are listed here on the slide. The second is that your project is in an eligible area for USDA RHS Section 515 program, and you determine that by emailing an email address of the USDA team, and then they send you a certification via email. And then the third option or the third methodology for determining rural status is if your project is in an incorporated city with a population of 40,000 or less, or in an unincorporated area which adjoins a city with that population of 40,000 or less. So this is something that if you're at all struggling with, the TA team can help you out with this determination. But again, here's the kind of three methodologies on the slide, and maybe I'll ask one of my colleagues if they can grab the hyperlink that I have in the notes and put it in the chat just so folks can look at the Tax Credit Allocation Committee rural methodology, because it kind of walks you through these methodologies in a little bit more detail. Okay, and Christine had mentioned a few slides ago that if you're concerned about meeting the density for RIPA projects, there are some allowances and some changes to the AHSC round 7 that make it a little bit easier. So projects can now calculate net density using either a unit count or a bedroom count. So that's new per this most recent version of the AHSC guidelines. And we expect that to be helpful, especially for rural projects trying to meet that net density threshold. You can also, there are allowable deductions. So for example, if your net density is coming in lower than you'd like it to, there are certain areas, and there are certain areas of your project site that are undevelopable. For example, maybe there's a septic system that's required there, public sidewalks or open space, public drainage facilities. You can deduct those areas from your net density calculation in order to meet that threshold. So some things to keep in mind for you if you're at all struggling with meeting those minimum density requirements as a rural community. And I believe with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Christine to talk a little bit more about the infill and farmland thresholds for AHSC.
Thanks, Kate. There's some good questions coming in the chat. Please feel free to keep dropping those in. But we are moving on to another threshold item that more commonly impacts specifically our rural, but sometimes our ICP project area type, but it is nonetheless applicable to all applicants looking to move an AHSC component forward. And that's the requirement that all sites be classified as infill. So there's kind of a test you do on your site to make sure you're meeting this requirement. And the first test is using a tool called the Farmland Mapping and Monitoring Map to ensure you're not proposing to build on a site that is currently designated as farmland. And you can see in the call out box on the right side, it has a little snippet of the map legend. There are multiple farmland designations. So if for some reason you do find that your site is showing up on the map as some type of farmland, there is a second step to the test. So if you can demonstrate that your site has either approximately 75% or 3 sides of the site perimeter is surrounded by developed uses, and there is a list of what qualifies as a developed use. Again, you'd want to talk to your TA provider to help you get that figured out. And you are either in an incorporated city or a designated urban service area. If you're in an unincorporated area, then you're in the clear and you qualify as an infill site. There's also an exemption for tribal applicants specifically for the requirement that you're either in an urbanized area or urban service area. So this is something we're familiar with working through with applicants on. If you do have concerns, again, we are available to help you work through that. Next slide, please. All right, a lot of thresholds, but these are some of the ones coming up next that we're going to walk through. There are requirements around developer experience, site control, where your project is at in terms of land use approvals and environmental clearances, a new requirement for all electric construction applied to housing sites. Alejandro mentioned you can't have started construction, and there's a performance period of 5 years from the time you are awarded funds. There is a comprehensive threshold checklist. If you're curious and you would like to review that, again, reach out to us. We're happy to send that over. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first item we want to highlight orients around developer experience. So every AHSC application has a developer as a primary applicant. And that is because the program has an experience requirement, which states that the developer entity needs to have at least 2 projects completed, so certificates of occupancy were issued within the last 10 years that are similar in size and scope to the proposed housing project. And really what this boils down to is making sure that the developer applicant is familiar with, working with HCD and other state agencies on managing their financing sources. So you want to make sure that you will meet that experience requirement. You can have additional formal applicants on your AHSC project, and you likely will because of what TCC requires overall in terms of its applicant structure. And you can see those are listed here on the other side of the screen. So most commonly we see public agencies like cities and counties partner on AHSC applications. Transit agencies are also typically entities that will sign on to an AHSC application. Less commonly, in fact, I don't think we've seen a school district applicant. And then round 7 guidelines, there have been some expansion of eligible tribal entities. So we're happy to talk to you if you are curious as to whether you qualify as an eligible applicant. It is worth noting who is not allowed to be an applicant. And I just want to call out that that applies to special purpose entities. So if you're setting up an LP or something similar to ultimately be the borrower of those TCC or AHSC dollars, do not list that LP as the applicant. What we've seen happen is that the LP is not considered to have the developer experience, even if the developer, is a participant in that LP. So you would be deemed ineligible. So just keep in mind, don't use your special purpose entity as an applicant. Next slide, please. Okay, site control. So there are a variety of options available to demonstrate that you have site control for the housing component specifically. And let's bump to the next slide to see that extensive list. So I'm not going to walk through this wall of text, but there are 7 different options, and the language is somewhat flexible to really capture a range of different site control structures. The key thing to take away here is that you need to have site control falling within one of these 7 items by the time you submit your TCC application. And again, this is for the housing site specifically. So if you're not sure you will have site control by the TCC deadline, you might want to consider a future round or some other options. And again, we're happy to walk through that with you. So I'm going to turn it over now to Alejandro again to continue our threshold review.
Great, thanks, Christine. So, let me first start off this section by saying that, the whole reason all of these requirements are in here is that the state wants to ensure that if they fund your housing development, it can and actually will be built. So Although these strict requirements can be challenging and onerous, remember that they're there for a reason. So that said, another major threshold requirement for your housing development is that it needs to have all discretionary local land use approvals, aka entitlements, complete by the time of application. There are some exceptions. So obviously this does not apply if you have a project that is by right. In addition, design review is excluded entirely from this requirement. So again, if you're thinking about applying to TCC for the next round, keep in mind that you must have those approvals in place by the application deadline. So, if you're not ready for this round of TCC and you might be ready in the future, that's something to think about in terms of your timeline. So with that, next slide, please. So another closely related item with the approvals, actually most of the time these are lumped together, is that you will need to have the environmental clearances by the time of application, and that either includes CEQA, the California Quality of Act, or NEPA, the national version. But there is a 30-day grace period after the application deadline if you have any appeals or lawsuits that need to be resolved. For NEPA approvals, if you need those for rental operating subsidies, though, those are actually exempted from this requirement. So again, emphasizing here that you must have all approvals as well as environmental clearances by the time of application, with the exception of the 30-day grace period for the environmental appeals or lawsuits. So with that, I'll move on to another important threshold requirement. Thanks. So that is for you to consider your financial feasibility, as that will be evaluated by state staff. I won't go exactly into the details of what is accepted as enforceable funding commitment, or EFC, as you can see in this slide. But just remember that you will be required to provide documentation of the enforceable funding commitments. In other words, you'll need letters verifying the commitment, a market study, pro forma, and other usually accompanying documents that you would expect for any other housing funding source. So think about your financial feasibility as well, and what types of financing commitments you can have in place by the time of application. Next slide, please. So finally, and I've mentioned this before, but I'll reiterate it, your project can't have started construction before the application deadline. And you, as Christine mentioned, you must complete the project in 5 years. In order to get credit for this housing development under TCC for the Equitable Housing Development Strategy, you must actually apply for TCC housing for the affordable housing development. Some prospective applicants in the past have mistakenly thought that they could take credit for recently constructed affordable housing projects. So just wanted to clear that up. Okay, so now that we've gone through all the major AHSC thresholds for the housing piece, and therefore to make sure that you have an eligible housing development for a TCC application, it's important to start thinking now about if you have a viable housing project. And if you do, you actually want to tune into our next webinar on February 15th, and we'll give you the exact time at the end of this presentation, where we will go into more of the specifics of the critical pieces of an AHSC application that are required for the TCC program. In the meantime, I will hand it back to Christine to walk us through a successful case study project from TCC that includes a housing component.
Thanks, Alejandro. Okay, so a lot of technical information thrown at you, but what does an AHSC component in a TCC award actually look like? We're highlighting a round one award that was made in Ontario. The award, or the application team terms our application Ontario together, and the total TCC award capped out at $35 billion. $18 million of that award went toward the application's AHSC component, which included a 101 unit affordable housing project called Vista Verde, developed by National Corps, and the other scoping items that you see on the screen here. So that was improved bus service frequency. They reused an existing city building, turned it into a mobility hub for public transit and active transportation needs, updated bus shelters with new electronic service displays, and they funded 5 miles of bike and pedestrian infrastructure, again, under that AHSC umbrella. So that's just the AHSC scope. Other components of their application included a lot of robust urban greening and climate resiliency components. So they planted almost 400 new trees throughout their project area, installed solar on single family homes, developed a whole carbon farm to convert food waste into high quality compost. A variety of workforce development services were offered. So you can see that while AHSC covers a lot, it was again just part of this project's overall application. Next slide, please. So this is a map of Ontario's TCC project area. And what we're really just trying to convey here is the point that both TCC and AHSC are programs about enhancing neighborhoods, right? So making improvements that go beyond just a single parcel. And so you can see a variety of different improvements were made throughout the project area. The housing portion that was submitted under this application is up in the upper right-hand corner. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of Vista Verde. It completed construction in 2020, and it was National Corps' actual first zero net energy, all electric development. Round 7 AHSC guidelines do require that all housing developments are all electric. So that I think is an important threshold requirement to keep in mind. And National Corps would have met that requirement back in the first round of the program. So that's pretty cool. Next slide, please. And just to sort of round it out, we are moving into the 5th round of the TCC program. So this map shows prior awardees from each of the past 4 rounds. You might notice a couple little asterisks. Some projects received partial awards, and actually the city of Stockton received partial awards in both round 3 and 4 to sort of round out their initial requests. If you are interested in advancing an AHSC component, again, within your broader TCC application, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. I know we're going to be putting all of our contact info on the slide and maybe in the chat. So we're definitely happy to help you figure out your options and have some of those initial conversations with you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Clancy, I believe, to round us out here.
All right, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Enterprise team and Kate, for all of your great knowledge. So we're going to move into the Q&A portion of this. Do we want to go through the chat first and answer those questions, and then we'll see if there's any additional ones?
Yeah, sounds good.
Excellent. All right, I will. One question. Oh, go ahead, Alejandro.
No, go ahead, Clancy, go ahead.
Yeah, so things like, I'm trying to get to the ones that we haven't answered. There we go, sorry. All right.
I can hop in. I saw Sally. Yeah, I know it's hard to track the chat while you're also presenting. Sally asked, will you be sending us a copy of the slides? Yes, we can definitely send the list of attendees a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. Thank you for asking.
Another question from Julie was, how does this translate to TCC? I think it was referring to when Christine was presenting the case study from Ontario, and specifically the question is, those other improvements are separate projects that meet the AHSC requirements. Do you want to take that, Christine?
Yeah, I was actually typing it out, but I can just respond verbally. Yeah, Julie. So AHSC is one of a variety of strategies that the TCC program refers to. So this is sort of like one segment of other TCC eligible projects. Anything that falls outside of that equitable neighborhood development strategy is going to have its own set of requirements. So we can't speak to those specifically, but the guidelines would lay out what those requirements are.
Right, Christine, I guess my question was more like, so the AHSC guidelines require these additional projects, right? Like transit oriented. And my question is, when we're looking at the TCC app, for example, if we're building out, we have projects under those other strategies that are transit, those meet the requirements for the housing component, right? It's not like we have to do other transportation projects that are also with the housing component.
Yeah, that is a great question. And we're, I think, currently working out exactly, because there is some duplication, right? As you mentioned, you can include transit improvements under other strategies. Our understanding to date is that if you are submitting a housing project under sort of this sub-AHSC portion within TCC, you need to at least meet minimum point requirements tied to AHSC. So you may not need, if you're familiar with AHSC as a standalone program, you may not need as robust scoping components under TCC as you would if you were applying for AHSC just on its own. If you have more specific questions, Julie, that's probably going to be more appropriate for like a one-on-one. We're happy to talk through that with you.
And then let me
Thank
just
you.
add, if I may, Julie, we're also going to go through some of those specifics, as I mentioned earlier, at that February 15th webinar, because again, the TCC differs to the AHSC guidelines. So there are some minimum requirements. And again, we will go through those on February the 15th.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Oh yeah, go ahead, Alejandro.
They asked about not clear if you should apply to both TCC or AHSC or just one. You get awarded from both or just one. That's an excellent question. And maybe actually I will give you the experience of my round 5 experience from AHSC, but also I'll let Christine answer. So they're not mutually exclusive. In the past, for example, I've worked on projects that have applied to both TCC and AHSC at the same time. However, that was because in those specific instances in round 5 of AHSC, at least, that the AHSC timeline coincided with the TCC timeline. This round, however, there is going to be a little bit of a difference in the timeline. So nothing prevents you from applying to both right now. However, just think about the duplication of effort that is required for that. Christine, did you have any other insight? Because I know you've had similar experiences.
Yeah, I would say, Kaylin, if you are, so TCC is very comprehensive, right? So it's not just about one housing project. If your community has other climate components and strategies it's trying to fund sort of in one collective application, then that's really what TCC is geared towards. If you are on here and you're like, well, I'm just looking for money for my affordable housing development, I don't, it's worth maybe considering AHSC as a standalone, or, talking within your community to see if there is an opportunity to bring in other strategies that would fit under TCC. Also, as Alejandro mentioned, the timing is going to be critical. TCC applications will be in, well, will they be in before the AHSC deadline? We don't know the AHSC deadline yet. So just your timing, I think, is an important factor as well.
Jack asked about the typical sorts of relationships and responsibilities of cities and the developer on the application, and who is the lead applicant, who is monitoring responsibilities, reporting requirements, etc. So I'll answer that in reverse, but please fill in here any of the other TAT members. So the AHSC regs do have incorporated into them monitoring and reporting requirements that are pretty standard from other state programs. Typically, the way this works out is you'll need a very close collaboration with the developer and a public agency, like a locality such as a city. And that's because basically, the process is that the developer is primarily in charge of overseeing all the housing components of an application, whether it's TCC or AHSC. And then on the other hand, the public partner, like just taking a city as an example, is primarily scoped with identifying all those active transportation and transportation improvements, which are under their jurisdiction and would be built by them anyway. There are exceptions to that, but that's generally the type of relationship and responsibilities that each of the parties has. Anything to add there?
No, I think we can bump. There's another question around the past TCC rounds requiring that housing, your projects have your 90% of your enforceable funding commitments. So AHSC, again, TCC is going to refer to the AHSC Round 7 guidelines, which has modified this threshold. There's no longer a 90% enforceable funding commitment threshold. There are, however, points attributed to the perm financing you have committed at the time of application. So, we can talk about that with you further if you maybe don't have all of that lined up, but it is no longer a AHSC program threshold. Probably in February, we can talk more about what that means for your TCC application overall, but at least for the AHSC component, it is no longer a threshold requirement.
There was a question about transportation in rural areas. I'm not sure if we addressed that. Specifically, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So AHSC, again, if you're in a RIPA project area type, can be used to bring transit to your housing site. And there are certainly plenty of case studies available to demonstrate that. So if you're curious about that, you can reach out to myself or Kate here on the line, and we're happy to talk about that with you further. There's another question around integrating strategies. I believe strategy to the land acquisition, yes, piece. So in terms of addressing the latter specific question, keep in mind that I'm not sure how that would work for site control. So the question is whether you could use TCC funds to secure or purchase a site for your housing project. Recall, AHSC requires you have site control at the time of application submittal. So we'd have to see what type of, like if you had an option to purchase agreement, what that looks like exactly. And then there's a 5-year period of performance. So you would also need to deliver the housing development within 5 years of award, and you would just want to make sure you could do that. So that one would probably need some specific, we'd need to look into it.
Great, which kind of leads to, it's the same question, but so strategy 2 is for acquisition of properties, but then it says in order to acquire, you have to have a construction component, like there has to be housing if you acquire. So like if you purchase like some NOAA and rehab it, like then that has to also adhere to AHSC. So I guess my question is, and they have to interface at some point, unless you're saying that if you're leaning on strategy 2, that whatever you purchase in rehab or purchase and build doesn't have to adhere to strategy 1.
That's my understanding, is that you can secure sites, and while you do need to have some sort of development plan, it doesn't necessarily need to be AHSC finance.
Because it's under strategy 2. Got it. Okay, that's really, really incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Good, I'm glad.
It's complicated, but thanks for the great questions. Maybe we should finish this off. We have a little bit less than 6 minutes. So Clancy, if you want to move us forward, okay, that'd be great.
Perfect. Thank you, Alejandro. And thank you all for the great questions. I'll do a little bit more info dumping, and also we'll have emails at the end for you all. So TCC application timeline. So currently we're in the pre-application technical assistance. It's available if you need it. So please, we'll have some links. Go to SGC's website and start looking at that pre-app technical assistance if it fits you and your organization situation. So in February, we are anticipating the final guidelines to be adopted by SGC, so looking out for that. And then March will be the release of the application and the NOFA. So if you're looking at a TC application, really April, May is when we're gonna have a pre-proposal submission deadline and final application coming this summer. So just giving you an idea of where we're going, timelines, and then TCC awards adopted in the fall by council. Next slide, please, Kate. So upcoming webinars, because we love a webinar. There's a ton of info out here for y'all. TCC staff and SGC and technical assistance providers are available for you. So some upcoming webinars. If you're just interested in a TCC planning grant, that is January 18th. Week later, January 25th, we have an TCC implementation grant webinar. And then upcoming in February, if you are a rural and or unincorporated community, we have a specific workshop for you. Just like on February 8th, we have a specific workshop for tribal communities. And then if you folks are interested in more ASIC and TCC information, February 15th, all the folks on this call, we will be back with some more specific information about incorporating that ASIC project into your TCC application. Next slide, Kate. All right, so all of these lovely webinars, you can register for all of them at sgc.ca.gov. Now that is going to be SGC's general website. There's some TCC specific. The link that we send out to all of you in the PowerPoint will be there. But yeah, these webinars are there. They're here for you all. So please, if you're interested, attend them, let us know. And like what Riley just said in the chat, you can attend multiple. They all will have different information specifically for those pieces highlighted in the titles. So next slide, please, Kate. All right, so next steps. I feel like we gave you all a lot of information, but what now? So like we said, when we get these presentations out to you, these are links. So we recommend reviewing the TCC Round 5 draft guidelines. They are in the draft form right now, but many of the things will hopefully stay the same. And then also review the ASIC threshold requirements for the project you have in mind. Also, like we said, you can complete the intake survey for pre-application TA. Folks are here for you. We want to help. And you can also reach out directly to the TA team. There's emails for the enterprise and the CCRH team attached. And I think we got 1 or 2 more slides, Kate, if you can forward to that. All right, and that TA survey, again, it's at sgc.ca.gov because technical assistance is a key component of TCC. So we have the resources available for y'all. This SGC understands that, hey, TCC can be a lot, so we're here to help. And next slide, please, Kate. And also, if you're a visual learner,
we have these YouTube channel. It has all of these recorded, and that's why we're recording this today. So make sure to check out SGC's YouTube channel. You could see a screenshot here of some of the previous webinars. So those will be available as well for when you want to check them out on your own time.
Thank you, Alejandro. And then I think that is all we have for you folks. Like we said, the previous webinars, we have fact sheets and a ton of other info at TCC on SGC's website. So please check that out and let us know how we can help. Thank you so much, Kate. How do we engage with TA? You can start filling out the pre-application TA assistance on SGC's website. So
we did do that. What's the next step after that?
Actually, we have someone from EA here who may be able to answer that. Riley, if you're able to come off of mute.
Yes, so the pre-application TA is mainly consists of these workshops and webinars, but we are offering one-on-one support specifically to applicants from tribal communities and unincorporated communities. So if you are not in one of those communities, we're not able to meet with you one-on-one until the application period, so basically until March. But if you are with the tribal or unincorporated community, you should have received an email either from me yesterday if you're with an unincorporated community, or from our partners at National Indian Justice Center for tribal communities. So hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And there was a question in the chat about accessing the TA survey. Do we have a link to that handy team that we can throw in the chat?
It's in there. Christine put it in.
I
Oh,
dropped
thanks,
it
Christine.
in. Yeah. You're welcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for spending your portion of your morning with us. Hope you have a great rest of your day. I think the team will hang on for just a few more moments, but I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and stop sharing.
Thanks everyone for attending. Great turnout.